Colonel Heinrich Kruger had been awake for 48 hours straight when his lead panzer rumbled down the muddy Ardennes road and stopped at the edge of what looked like an abandoned American supply depot, its crude perimeter fence swaying in the cold December wind. The year was 1944, the Bulge Offensive in full swing, and for the first time in months, his men smelled something close to hope. The radio crackled with chaos, units advancing, collapsing, burning fuel faster than they could capture it. And then came the impossible report, an unguarded cache of Allied supplies ahead, barely defended. Kruger didn't believe it at first. Intelligence had been unreliable for weeks, and the Americans never left their fuel behind unless it was a trap. But as his convoy of tanks and trucks rolled cautiously into the yard, headlights cutting through mist, the truth gleamed before them. Endless rows of steel drums stamped U.S. Army fuel in bold white letters. 50,000 gallons, maybe more, liquid gold. For a moment the colonel could only stare, his breath forming a fog in the air as he tried to comprehend the scale. The drums stretched into the darkness like soldiers standing at attention, perfectly aligned, untouched. "Mein Gott," muttered Captain Albrecht beside him. "We could run to Paris on this." The men laughed, delirious with relief. For weeks they'd been siphoning from wrecked vehicles, begging local farmers for diesel, even burning captured vodka for engine fires. Now here it was salvation, shimmering under the pale moonlight. Kruger stepped forward and kicked one of the drums, hearing the hollow metallic echo that confirmed it was full. The sound was beautiful, almost musical. "Get the pumps," he barked, and the men scattered like ants, setting up hoses, shouting orders, their exhaustion forgotten. Engines roared to life, and the scent of gasoline filled the air, sharp, intoxicating, forbidden. For a brief, glorious hour, it felt like the tide had turned. Trucks lined up, tanks refilled, and laughter echoed across the depot as soldiers smoked and joked in the glow of their torches. One young mechanic even saluted a drum like a general. "Our new commander, sir," he shouted to a chorus of laughter, but Kruger didn't smile. As he watched the fuel pour, something inside him shifted, a faint unease he couldn't name. There was too much. The Americans had left it behind not because they were careless, but because they could afford to. 50,000 gallons meant nothing to an army that could replace it by morning. For Germany, this was a miracle. For America, it was a rounding error. That realization sat heavy in his chest. As dawn crept over the treetops, Kruger climbed onto a tank and surveyed the scene, the rows of barrels gleaming like trophies, the men cheering, the forest echoing with the clatter of pumps. The victory was intoxicating but fragile. His adjutant approached with a clipboard, eyes wide. "Herr Oberst, the fuel is clean, pure high-octane. The Americans use this for their Shermans and Thunderbolts." Kruger took a deep breath, the fumes stinging his throat. "High-octane," he repeated quietly. "They burn it like water." The thought gnawed at him. For months his division had been limping on synthetics, brittle, smoky, barely enough to keep their engines running. Every liter here was precious, but it was also a glimpse into the enemy's world, a world of abundance, of factories that never slept, of trains that crossed oceans of land. He had seen a few of those factories once, in captured intelligence photographs, endless rows of assembly lines, women in overalls, mountains of parts waiting to be shipped. He had dismissed them then as propaganda. Now, standing in a sea of American fuel, he realized the truth was worse than propaganda. It was efficiency made flesh. Hours passed, and the laughter began to fade as the men realized how impossible it was to move everything. They didn't have enough trucks, enough drums, enough time. Every gallon they loaded was one they couldn't guard. Word spread that American patrols were regrouping nearby. Kruger ordered defensive positions to be set up, machine guns along the perimeter, camouflaged vehicles under tarps. But even as he gave the orders, a hollow certainty began to grow. They would never get it all out. The Wehrmacht had become a starving army trying to feast on a banquet it couldn't carry. When Albrecht approached, excitement shining in his eyes, holding up a clipboard that listed the captured supplies, 48,700 gallons accounted for, plus crates of rations, ammunition, even chocolate, Kruger could only nod. "Well done, Captain," he he said mechanically. But as Albrecht walked away, Kruger whispered to himself, "They left this behind because they have 10 more like it." That night, as his men celebrated with cigarettes and stolen American coffee, Kruger sat in his command truck, staring at the fuel logs. He'd been fighting since Poland, through France, Russia, and now back into the Ardennes. He'd seen victories, defeats, and everything in between, but this was different. It wasn't a battle of tactics anymore. It was a battle of production, of machines, of numbers that dwarfed human will. He thought of the American trucks he'd seen on reconnaissance, big, loud, endless convoys stretching for miles. They didn't rely on miracles or propaganda, they relied on logistics. And logistics, he realized, was something Germany could no longer fight. His hand trembled as he picked up his pen and began writing in his logbook. "We have captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel. For us, it is victory. For them, it is nothing. This war will not be won by courage but by capacity." Outside, the men were singing a crude, drunken rendition of Erica, the song echoing through the forest. Kruger stepped out, watching them dance around barrels like villagers celebrating a harvest. He wanted to join them, to feel their fleeting joy, but the weight in his chest grew heavier. From the tree line, he could see the faint glow of fires in the distance, American flares, artillery, or perhaps just another depot burning. The night was alive with distant thunder, the echo of a war still raging, unstoppable. He turned to Albrecht. "Get ready to move at first light," he ordered. "We take what we can and destroy the rest." Albrecht frowned. "Destroy it, but sir—" "Do it," Kruger snapped, then softened. "If we can't use it, no one can." The captain hesitated, then saluted. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky gray, Kruger lit a cigarette and stood by the largest fuel drum, the smoke curling upward like a ghost. He thought of his wife, of the letter he'd received weeks ago, paper stained with soot, words trembling with fear. "We have no coal for the winter," she had written. "They say the Americans are coming." He'd read it then with defiance. Now he read it again in his mind and felt only resignation. The Americans weren't coming. They were already everywhere, in the skis, on the roads, in the rhythm of an economy that could outbuild empires. His sergeant approached. "Orders, Herr Oberst," Kruger exhaled slowly. "We take what fuel we can carry, then we light the rest." Hours later, as the last truck rolled out of the depot, Kruger stood on the ridge, watching as flames consumed the barrels, black smoke rising into the cold air like the dying breath of the Reich itself. The men didn't cheer this time. They watched in silence, the reflection of fire flickering in their hollow eyes. 50,000 gallons of fuel, the symbol of everything they lacked, gone in a pyre of necessity. Kruger turned away, his voice low and heavy. This was never ours to win. And as the convoy rumbled into the distance, leaving the burning depot behind, the colonel knew the Americans hadn't lost their fuel that day. They had merely shown him how endless their supply truly was, and how finite his own world had become. Colonel Heinrich Weiss had never seen such chaos painted across the heavens, flaming contrails, tumbling aircraft, and the bitter perfume of burning oil filling the morning air. The convoy had been ambushed 2 hours earlier by an American fighter group that seemed to appear from nowhere. The colonel had ordered his men to form a perimeter around the fuel trucks, but even as he barked commands, he knew the truth. They were trapped. Half the Panzer Regiment's supply line lay in smoldering ruin, and what hadn't burned was scattered across the French countryside. The colonel crouched behind an overturned Kubelwagen, clutching his binoculars, watching as a lone P-47 Thunderbolt screamed overhead, its 8.50 caliber gun stitching lines of fire into the earth. "Get the Flakvierling online," Weiss shouted, his voice cracking through the pandemonium. A young corporal obeyed, dragging the quadruple-barreled anti-aircraft gun into position. The men fired, and the sky lit up with angry blossoms of black smoke, but the Thunderbolt climbed higher, then dove again, fearless, relentless. The colonel admired the pilot's skill even as he cursed at him. "He fights like a demon," he muttered to himself. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the roar receded. The Americans had withdrawn, leaving behind destruction, screams, and a silence so complete it hummed in the ears. Weiss emerged from cover, brushing ash from his gray uniform. Around him, trucks burned with the fury of a dozen bonfires, each one representing hundreds of gallons of fuel he'd captured just days before in a daring raid on an American supply dump near the Meuse River. That raid had been his proudest moment, a night attack executed with ruthless precision, seizing not only 50,000 gallons of gasoline but the morale of every man under his command. They had cheered him, hoisted him on their shoulders, calling him the hero of the fuel raid. Even the high command had taken notice. His name was wired to Berlin. But now, standing amid the wreckage, he felt that glory slipping away, replaced by a gnawing dread that even he couldn't disguise. The war machine of Germany was starving, of fuel, of hope, of truth. And the Americans, those loud, industrial juggernauts, were growing stronger every day. Weiss gathered his surviving officers that evening under the dim glow of a lantern, its light flickering across their soot-streaked faces. "We have lost 20 trucks," he said flatly, "but the remaining fuel must reach Ardennes. If it doesn't, our tanks will die before they reach the front." His men nodded wearily, though their eyes betrayed the hopelessness creeping in. Sergeant Kruger, the oldest among them, spoke quietly. "Herr Colonel, the Americans, they fly as if they own the sky now." Weiss paused, staring at the man. "Then we must own the night," he replied, the words heavy but resolute. That night, as rain began to fall, Weiss walked alone through the rows of burned-out vehicles. He touched one truck's metal side, still warm, still reeking of gasoline and death, and remembered his youth in Bavaria, tinkering with motorbikes, dreaming of engines and freedom. He'd believed in the Reich then, believed in the promises of power, pride, and destiny. But those dreams had turned to smoke, just like this convoy. In the distance, thunder rolled, but it wasn't thunder, it was the muffled growl of engines. Weiss froze. Lights flickered on the horizon, faint but growing. He lifted his field glasses and his stomach turned. American half-tracks, dozens of them, moving like ghosts through the fog. "Prepare to move," he shouted, sprinting back to camp. The men scrambled, loading what fuel remained onto whatever trucks still ran. "We'll head east," Weiss barked, "through the forest roads." The convoy roared to life, sputtering and coughing black smoke as they rolled into the dark woods. Behind them, tracer fire streaked the night like red lightning. Hours passed. The rain thickened. The roads turned to mud, slowing them to a crawl. "Keep going," Weiss yelled over the engine noise. A driver cried out. The rear truck had slipped, wheels spinning uselessly. Kruger ran to help, but a shell exploded nearby, throwing him into the ditch. Weiss grabbed him by the collar, dragging him up, both men gasping. "We're not dying here," the colonel growled. They finally freed the truck, pushing onward until dawn painted the sky with a pale, cold light. When they finally stopped, they had lost 3 more vehicles, but the rest had made it. Weiss stood atop a small ridge, surveying the battered column below. He could see the fuel drums glinting faintly in the morning sun, and despite the exhaustion, a grim smile touched his face. "We still have enough," he said quietly. "Enough for one more strike." But as he looked east toward Germany, he saw the smoke of Allied bombings rising like black mountains on the horizon. He didn't need a map to understand what it meant. The Reich was burning, and no amount of stolen fuel could change that. Still, as he turned to his men, he straightened his cap, forced his chin high, and said, "We move at dusk. The fatherland still breathes." They believed him because they had to, but deep inside, Colonel Heinrich Weiss knew that the fire consuming Europe would not be extinguished by loyalty or courage. It would only end when there was nothing left to burn. The convoy rumbled eastward under a heavy gray sky, each truck growling like an exhausted beast dragging itself toward its final breath. And Colonel Heinrich Weiss sat in the lead vehicle, his gloved hand gripping the door handle as though the metal could somehow anchor him to sanity. The forest roads had turned to swamps after the rain, and every mile cost them another hour, another gallon, another soldier's nerve. "Herr Colonel," Sergeant Kruger called from the passenger seat, his voice coarse from smoke and sleeplessness, "if we don't find shelter soon, the engines will drown before the Allies even find us." Weiss didn't answer immediately. He was staring out the cracked windshield at the ghostly silhouettes of pine trees flashing past in the gloom. "The Allies are never far, Kruger," he said finally, his tone dry. They fly, they listen, they smell fuel like wolves smell blood. The sergeant gave a bitter chuckle. Then we'll give them nothing but fumes. In the back of the truck, 3 young soldiers, barely men, all mud-streaked and hollow-eyed, sat with their rifles resting on their knees, whispering about the rumors they'd heard on the radio. Paris liberated, the Wehrmacht retreating, the Russians closing from the east. Weiss could hear them even over the grinding gears, and though he said nothing, the words cut deeper than any bullet. He thought of his wife in Munich, the last letter she'd sent him weeks ago, folded neatly in his breast pocket. It smelled faintly of lavender and ink and heartbreak. "Come home soon," she had written. "Our son asks when his father will stop chasing ghosts." He looked down at the patch on his sleeve, the silver eagle, the symbol of the Reich, and wondered when he had become one of those ghosts himself. The column reached a small village by midday, or what was left of it, bombed roofs, shattered windows, and the eerie quiet of a place emptied of life. "Check the wells," Weiss ordered. "We need water for the radiators." The men scattered, stepping over rubble and abandoned carts. A church bell lay in the street, split clean in half. Kruger knelt beside it, brushing away the dust. "Even God's lost his voice," he muttered. Weiss ignored him, scanning the sky instead. For once it was empty, no thunderbolts, no contrails, just silence. It made him uneasy. They refueled and pressed on, following the railway line toward Aachen, hopping to find a supply depot still intact. But that hope died an hour later when a reconnaissance plane droned overhead, silver and predatory. "Cover the convoy," Weiss shouted, diving behind the wheel again. The men scattered, trucks swerving off the road as machine gun fire raked the ground. One truck burst into flame, another flipped into the ditch. The colonel's ears rang with the shrieks of metal and men. Then the plane was gone, leaving only black smoke curling upward like fingers reaching for heaven. By nightfall, only 5 trucks remained. Weiss ordered the survivors to stop beneath a viaduct. They ate cold rations in silence, the firelight flickering over faces that no longer looked human. One of the younger soldiers' hands stared at Weiss with wide eyes. "Herr Colonel, do you think we can still win?" The question hung in the damp air, absurd and heartbreaking. Weiss met his gaze. "Soldier," he said quietly, "I don't think anymore, I only move." The boy nodded slowly, but his lip trembled. Later that night, while the men slept, Weiss stood by the railway tracks, the stars above dim through the haze. He lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his sharp, weary features. He thought of the fuel tanks in the trucks behind him, precious, irreplaceable, and of what he might do with them. Deliver them to command, or destroy them before the Allies could take them. Both seemed equally pointless. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, a low, endless growl rolling across the land. The front was closer than he'd thought. Suddenly, a sound, a faint clatter, boots on gravel. Weiss spun, pistol drawn. From the darkness emerged 3 figures, American scouts, their helmets glinting faintly. Time froze. For a long second, neither side moved. Then everything exploded at once. Shots cracked through the night. One American fell, another ducked behind a rail cart. Weiss fired again, striking the third in the shoulder, but a return burst shattered the rock near his head. He dove for cover, mud splattering his uniform. "Ambush!" someone screamed from the camp. Chaos ignited. Muzzle flashes blinked like fireflies as Germans and Americans clashed in the shadows. Kruger dragged a wounded man to safety, shouting, "Fall back to the bridge." Weiss joined him, firing as he ran, heart hammering. The Americans were fewer but better positioned, and when one of their grenades landed near the trucks, Weiss knew what would happen next. "No." He yelled, sprinting toward the convoy, but the blast came anyway, brilliant, deafening. One truck went up in flames, and within seconds the fire spread to the rest. The colonel was thrown backward by the shockwave, landing hard on the cold ground. When he opened his eyes, the night was orange and screaming. Fuel drums burst like bombs, sending geysers of flame into the sky. The Americans retreated, silhouetted by the inferno, while the Germans scrambled in vain to save what little remained. Weiss crawled toward the wreckage, coughing, his face streaked with soot. The trucks were gone. The precious fuel, his one victory, his only purpose, was gone. Kruger found him kneeling beside the flames, eyes blank. "Herr Colonel, it's finished," the sergeant said softly. Weiss didn't look at him. He just watched the fire consuming everything, whispering, "So this is how the Reich dies, not with surrender but with smoke." As dawn crept over the horizon, only ashes remained. The few survivors huddled near the bridge, silent and broken. Weiss stood apart, staring at the tracks stretching east. In the distance, trains still moved, Allied trains now, carrying endless supplies, endless men. He realized then the awful truth. Germany could never outfight this. Not the factories, not the engines, not the sky filled with steel birds. The war had already been decided, by oil, by industry, by time. Still, he turned to his men, what few were left, and said the only words he could manage, "We keep moving." And though he knew it was hopeless, they followed, because following was all they had left. By the time Colonel Heinrich Weiss and his battered men stumbled into the outskirts of Aachen, they looked less like soldiers of the Reich and more like ghosts crawling through the ashes of a dead dream. Their uniforms torn, faces blackened by smoke, boots soaked with oil and blood. The city, once proud with its cathedrals and cobblestones, now lay gutted and hollow, its streets carved open by artillery, and its air thick with the scent of burning fuel and despair. Weiss's convoy, what little remained of it, rolled to a stop before a makeshift command post in what had once been a schoolhouse. Inside, maps were nailed to chalkboards, candles flickered over typewriters, and officers with hollow eyes argued in hushed tones about the front collapsing in the west. When Weiss entered, silence fell. Even his tattered uniform carried authority, and the stench of smoke followed him like a funeral procession. A young adjutant hurried over. "Herr Oberst, Command has been asking for the fuel delivery from your sector for 2 days. Where is it?" Weiss looked past him, toward the map marked with red pins bleeding across the Rhine, and replied quietly, "Burned, all of it." The adjutant froze. "All?" Weiss nodded once. The officer stammered, then "The offensive is already over," Weiss said flatly, removing his cap. His hair was streaked with gray now, though he was only 43. The room filled with whispers. Somewhere, a radio crackled with news of the Allies advancing. A major with a scarred face stepped forward, fury trembling in his voice. "Colonel Weiss, that fuel was critical for the counterattack at Remagen. Do you understand what you've cost us?" Weiss's gaze was steady, almost pitying. "I understand that we no longer have factories, rail lines, or oil fields left to use it," he said. "You can't fight a war on ashes." The major lunged forward, fist trembling, but another officer restrained him. The room descended into chaos, accusations flying like shrapnel, until Weiss simply walked out, his boots echoing down the empty corridor. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and indifferent to the dying world around it. His men were gathered near the trucks, sharing the last of their rations. Kruger approached, his arm bandaged, face gaunt. "Command blames us," he said. Weiss managed a dry smile. "Command blames anyone still alive." He lit a cigarette, the glow trembling in the cold wind. "Do you think they'll shoot us?" Kruger asked after a long silence. "No," Weiss said, exhaling smoke that drifted into the snow. "They'll need us to die fighting first." That night, the remnants of the regiment were ordered to hold a bridge leading into the city, though everyone knew it was hopeless. The Americans were pushing closer each day, their tanks growling like thunder. Weiss inspected his lines, young boys clutching rifles too big for them, old men with shaking hands, machine guns propped on sandbags that looked older than the soldiers manning them. "You've fought enough," he told one trembling conscript. "When the shooting starts, go home, find your family." The boy stared at him, confused. "And you, Herr Colonel?" Weiss's eyes flickered with something almost human. "I lost my home a long time ago." Just before dawn, the bombardment began. The earth shook, windows shattered, the sky lit up in white flashes that erased the snow. American artillery pounded the bridge, and soon the first tanks appeared through the mist, Shermans, lined up like metal gods. Weiss barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos, but he knew it was useless. The machine guns opened fire, tracers slicing through the air, and the first German position exploded into dust. Kruger crawled beside him, shouting over the thunder, "We can't hold." Weiss didn't answer. He watched as one of the Shermans rolled over the bridge, its treads crushing sandbags, its turret turning toward them like an eye of fate. He gave the signal, and a lone Panzerfaust streaked across the bridge, striking the tank square in the side. The explosion sent flames leaping skyward, and for one brief, glorious second the men cheered. But then 3 more Shermans appeared, followed by infantry. The roar of engines drowned everything. The bridge became hell. Shells ripped through stone. The river below boiled with debris. Weiss ran between his men, dragging the wounded back, shouting orders, his uniform torn and face streaked with soot. The air reeked of cordite and burning oil. Somewhere behind him, Kruger screamed, then fell silent. By midday, the bridge was gone, collapsed into the river. Weiss stumbled through the ruins, half-deaf, his ears ringing. The Americans had stopped firing. The city was theirs. He found Kruger's body among the rubble, eyes open, blood frozen on his lips. Weiss knelt beside him, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Rest, old friend," he whispered. Around him, the last of his men were surrendering, hands raised, faces hollow. For a long time, Weiss just sat there, watching the smoke rise over the Rhine. He had once believed Germany could build 1,000 planes for everyone it lost, that discipline and courage could replace the iron and oil they lacked. But now, surrounded by wreckage and silence, he saw the truth. The war had been decided not by bravery but by machinery. The Americans had more of everything: steel, fuel, men, time. And as the snow continued to fall, covering the dead, Weiss felt something inside him finally break, not from fear but from understanding. When the American soldiers approached, rifles leveled, Weiss stood without resistance, raising his hand slowly. "Colonel Heinrich Weiss," he said in perfect English, his voice low but clear, "I surrender." One of the young sergeants, barely older than his own son, looked at him with pity and nodded. "Then it's over, sir." Weiss shook his head faintly. "No," he said. "It ended long before today. We were just too blind to see it." As they led him away, past the bridge and the river that now reflected both ruin and dawn, Weiss glanced once more at the rising smoke. It looked almost peaceful now, curling into the sky like a funeral prayer. He wondered what his wife would tell their son, that his father fought bravely, or that he finally stopped fighting what couldn't be won. Either way, the story would end the same, with a man who had captured 50,000 gallons of fuel, only to realize too late that no amount of fire could keep the Reich from freezing to death. The train clattered westward under a bruised sky, its engine coughing smoke that twisted into the cold morning like the breath of something ancient dying. And inside one of the freight cars sat Colonel Heinrich Weiss, unarmed, unshaven and silent, staring at his own reflection in the metal wall as it trembled with each mile closer to captivity. Across from him, a group of his surviving men huddled together, their eyes hollow, their uniforms stiff with dried mud and soot. One of them, young Hans, the boy who had once asked him if Germany could still win, broke the silence. "Herr Colonel," he said softly, voice cracking, "what will they do to us?" Weiss looked at him for a long time, his gaze unreadable. "Feed us," he said finally. The words hung in the air like a ghost, absurd and true. Outside, through the slats in the wooden car, they could see the landscape changing. Villages untouched by war, factories still smoking, rail lines that stretched clean and unbroken. Weiss felt his throat tighten. For years, the Reich had told them that America was soft, decadent, unorganized, yet the evidence of its strength was already rumbling beneath his boots. When the train stopped at dusk, guards shouted for them to disembark. They were marched through a rail yard crawling with motion, endless freight cars filled with oil drums, crates of food, trucks stacked like toys. Even in defeat, the Americans moved with precision that made the German army look like scavengers. "Mein Gott," one of the sergeants whispered. "They build like this every day." Weiss didn't answer. He was too busy looking at a single tank being hoisted by a crane onto a flatbed, its paint fresh, its tracks spotless, its engine already humming. For every tank Germany had lost, America had made 10. And now, standing among prisoners, Weiss realized what true warfare meant. Not flags, not speeches, not courage, but production. When they reached the camp, barbed wire glistened under floodlights. The guards were young but calm, their uniforms crisp, their rifles carried with casual confidence. Inside, the prisoners were given blankets, coffee, even cigarettes. It was not mercy, Weiss realized, it was efficiency. "Colonel Weiss," an American lieutenant said, approaching him with a clipboard, "you'll be processed and assigned quarters. Any injuries? Weiss met his eyes. Just the kind that don't bleed. The lieutenant nodded slowly, perhaps understanding. Later in the barracks, Weiss sat on his cot, holding the steaming mug of coffee between his hands. It had been years since he'd tasted something that wasn't bitter or burnt. The warmth spread through him, unfamiliar, unsettling. Around him, his men murmured in disbelief about the food, the order, the sheer abundance. One muttered, "If this is defeat, it feels like wealth." Another laughed bitterly. "They treat prisoners better than we treat our own." Weiss didn't laugh. He just stared at the ceiling, his mind unraveling decades of propaganda, pride, and pain. He thought of the fuel he'd captured, 50,000 gallons, once a symbol of hope, now meaningless beside the oceans of oil that powered America's machines. That cash hadn't been victory. It had been a grain of sand trying to fight a tide. Days turned into weeks. The prisoners worked in the camp workshops, repairing equipment or tending fields. Weiss found himself drawn to the mechanical sheds, places that smelled of grease and invention. There he saw things that unsettled him more than any battle. Engines larger than tanks, turbines, conveyor belts, electric welding machines that spat light like captured lightning. One day an American engineer noticed him watching and said, "You built planes, didn't you?" Weiss nodded cautiously. "For the Luftwaffe." The man smiled faintly. "We built everything else." It wasn't arrogance, it was simple truth. Over the next few days, the two men spoke often. The engineer's name was Jack Monroe, a factory supervisor from Ohio before the war. He talked about assembly lines that could build a bomber every hour, shipyards that launched destroyers weekly, towns that existed solely to forge steel. "We don't just fight with guns, Colonel," Monroe said one afternoon, tightening a bolt on a tractor engine. "We fight with hammers, trucks, typewriters, hell, even kids back home are knitting socks faster than your generals plan attacks." Weiss smiled despite himself. "And we thought we were disciplined." Monroe handed him a wrench. "You are, but discipline isn't power, scale is." That sentence lodged in Weiss's chest like a bullet. At night, as he lay awake, he could still hear the hum of the American generators outside the wire, steady, tireless, eternal. He began writing notes in the margins of old forms he'd been given, sketches of machines, thoughts about production, questions about energy and manpower. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was habit, perhaps hope. One morning, Hans approached him shyly, holding a folded newspaper the guards had left behind. On the front page was a photo of Allied soldiers shaking hands over the Elbe, the war officially ending in Europe. Beneath it, a headline read, "Factories shift to peacetime output." Hans frowned. "They win and already they build again." Weiss took the paper gently. "That's why they won." The camp buzzed with rumors of release, of repatriation. Some prisoners rejoiced, others feared returning to a land they no longer recognized. Weiss stood apart watching the guards dismantle an old jeep. Monroe approached him one last time. "War over, Colonel," he said. "Guess we both go home." Weiss looked at the horizon, flat, endless, clean. "Home," he repeated softly, as though testing the word for cracks. Monroe hesitated. "You'll rebuild Germany, right? She'll need men who understand both war and peace." Weiss didn't answer immediately. He was remembering his wife's letter, the one that smelled of lavender and regret, and his son's question, "When will you stop chasing ghosts?" He finally said, "I don't think my country will trust a man who learned more from his enemy than from his leaders." Monroe smiled sadly. "Then maybe that's exactly the kind of man it needs." That night, as the lights dimmed and the camp fell silent, Weiss walked to the wire fence. Beyond it, the American machinery still hummed, the sound steady as a heartbeat. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of industry, of creation, of a future his own nation had tried to build with fear instead of faith. When he opened them again, the eastern sky was turning pale. He whispered to no one. The Reich burned its soul for oil and still froze. Behind him, Hans stirred and muttered in his sleep. Weiss smiled faintly. Perhaps the boy would live long enough to see a Germany that built instead of destroyed. Perhaps that was enough. The next morning, when the guards came to call his name for repatriation, Colonel Heinrich Weiss stood tall, saluted once toward the horizon, and walked forward without looking back, leaving behind not just a camp but a war, and stepping quietly into the uncertain dawn of peace.